Welcome back to another Reddit Readings video. If you enjoy these stories, don't be scared to leave a like. Now, do be scared. Sit back, relax, and enjoy. My coworker has been adding a little more than just sugar and cream to his coffee. I had to figure it out. At first, it was amusing to watch, then it became puzzling, and then aggravating. Every day I'd watch my coworker take a sip from his coffee mug, the same ivory, obviously handcrafted coffee mug. He'd take a sizable sip, grimace for at least 3 to 4 seconds, and then take another sip after his face had relaxed. He'd repeat this behavior 2 or 3 times, then set the mug down and resume his work. Later, perhaps an hour or 2, he'd conduct the little ritual again, the intensity of the grimacing never intensifying, but not waning either. Like anyone else, my initial thought was that he had simply added a hefty dose of alcohol to the cup and was grimacing at the strength of the booze or the overall taste of the concoction. Like someone who knows how to mind their own business, I never asked him, never confronted this person who might genuinely need a little extra in his cup to get through the mind-breaking mundanity of our job. But I'm still a curious person and couldn't simply let this assumption ride completely unconfirmed, especially not since he'd do this every single day. I've never personally known an alcoholic, but his productivity and the quality of his work were not reflective of someone who was always on the edge of a buzz, clinging less and less to sobriety. No offense to alcoholics, I'm sure there are some efficient, perfectly functional ones. Subtly, or so I hoped, I started to walk by his desk right after he'd take a sip. But never once did I smell even the faintest scent of booze. Coffee, sure, and something stale and slightly acrid, like burnt sweetener, but never the distinctly pungent scent of alcohol. As far as I was concerned, the man was clean. Something else about the coffee was making him physically wince and go misty-eyed with every sip, and I was determined to find out what. There is no coffee maker at our office. The company could easily afford to give us each our own. Our manager has a very flashy, assuredly expensive one in his office, but they've never supplied the employees with one in our break room. And while I can't speak for everyone, I've decided to never shell out the 20 or so bucks to buy a cheap coffee maker to save everyone the trouble, because I know that's exactly what the company wants us to do, and I'm too much of a spiteful, petty person to let them win this virtually non-existent squabble. So I make my coffee at home. The point behind all this is that one day I thought of a plan to find out once and for all what the hell was in my coworker's cringe-inducing coffee. Leaving my coffee mug in the car after having gulped down the throat-searing brew, of course, I came into work and said aloud, very close to him, "Damn it, I forgot my coffee." He had just been in the process of taking a sip from his mug, presumably the first of the day. My little practiced outburst stopped him, and before his lips could touch the cup I followed my little performance up with, "Would you mind if I had a tiny sip of yours, just to start the day?" I motioned toward the water cooler, on which sat little plastic cups, showing that I wouldn't even have to infringe upon the surface area of his cup with my stranger lips. He stared at me for a moment, inscrutable and silently, and then looked to his cup, intently, as if staring into a depth far greater than that of the 16 ounces container. Finally, after what had to have been 6 seconds of weird, uncomfortable silence, he nodded, almost solemnly, as a priest might upon pondering the legitimacy of a frequent sinner's claim of contrition. Barely containing my morbid excitement, I went and retrieved one of the plastic cups and set it before him, as if pouring a sacramental drop. To further the Catholic analogy, there was a genuine air of reverence in how he gently tipped his mug toward the cup to let the black, steaming liquid stream out. Once done, he returned the lid to his mug and slid the plastic cup back to me. I took it, thanked him profusely and sincerely. My curiosity had reached its boiling point, and returned to my desk. I didn't look back at him upon arriving, but I knew that he was watching me, as casually as I could manage. Given my palpable excitement, I brought the cup to my lips and took a small sip. The experience was unlike anything I could have ever imagined, and upon regaining my composure I found myself shocked, profoundly amazed at how my coworker had so routinely imbibed the liquid with only a grimace or shudder afterwards. The base, fundamental element was coffee, yes, a dark roast, without sugar or cream, brewed strongly, but the drink's overall potency, its primary effect, was owed not to the caffeine, but to the other element, the thing with which the drink had been spiked. I was not immediately made aware of this singular ingredient, and at the moment could only guess, with hilarious inaccuracy, at its nature. But I knew, before being told later, that it wasn't something you'd find in any store, and neither was it procurable through any legal means or channels. And as my coworker had done so many times before, I recoiled from it, as if I had instead sipped boiled poison. Its basic taste is not necessarily acrid, but more so slimy and ill-textured, offensive to the palate in multiple ways, none of which I can sufficiently describe. But what I can describe, what I can, strangely, give a clear account of, is the resultant feeling, the physical discomfort and mental disclarity of its consumption. The immediate sensation elicited was one of mental displacement. Swallowing the substance brought an abrupt shift in my sense of equilibrium, not dissimilar to missing a step when descending a staircase. That brief, panic-inducing sense of weightlessness, wherein you feel as if you've been betrayed by either the architecture of the building or gravity itself. Following on the heels of this was a mounting sense of dread, seemingly sourceless, though nonetheless powerful and nerve-firing. I felt the ominous, cataclysm-auguring approach of something, the imminent arrival of a thing or entity whose sole and dark-hearted purpose was the end of all terrestrial life, and not just on Earth, but on every biologically inhabited sphere in the cosmos. This dread and cosmic anxiety soon gave way to a pitch-black, soul-dampening despair as I became assured that nothing, no power on Earth would be able to stop the arrival of this ultramundane presence. In a deeply worrying cardiac event, my heart rate climaxed and then reversed to a glacial, murmurous slowness. I suddenly felt wrapped up in an invisible, languor-inducing web, to await the predatory encroachment of its inhuman weaver. My mind was then filled with visions, fleeting, nebulous, and largely indescribable in their imagery, but carrying the same import of unavoidable doom. Flashes of lightless gulfs, endlessly imploding voids, vast basins filled with volcanic shadows, titanic shards of obliterated worlds floating listlessly in the black vacuity of outer space, all omening some ultimate undoing of life. And through it all, present amidst every abysmal vista, ubiquitous among the horrific scenery, was a figure, sometimes appearing as a solid, tangible thing, and other times as a warped, amorphous fragment of some ultra-human body, the nightmarish memory of something too horrible to maintain a composite form. And then, just as abruptly as it had come, the feeling left me. The dread and despair and awful, unplacatable sorrow melted away, and I was back at work, sitting calmly, suddenly instilled with a deep sense of clarity, of peacefulness. I looked into the cup and saw my normal face reflected back at me. I was sure I would see a terror-stricken, despair-befallen expression, but my face was relaxed, my expression befitting someone who had moments ago been told they would no longer need to worry about some previously confounding problem. My coworker's hand fell on my shoulder, and looking up at him I saw that same expression of total serenity. He smiled and told me to find him after work. He then returned to his desk, and we separately attended to our tasks for the day. The day ended, and as he had asked, I found him waiting outside of the entrance to the building. He told me to follow him home, and without asking why, I complied. I knew immediately that there was more to the peculiar coffee, that the sordid, ineffable half-images and suggestions I had witnessed in my mind held a greater significance. He pulled into his driveway and I parked along the road, not expecting to be there for long. He waited for me to exit my car, and then gestured for me to follow him to the garage, first looking around furtively. He motioned for me to stand next to him, and then typed the door's code into the keypad. The garage began to open, and just when it had risen to about chest level, he gripped me by the shoulders, pulled me down, and flung me inside. I barely managed to get my hands up and prevent myself from falling face first onto the dusty concrete. I heard him clamber in behind me, and then the reversal of the garage's motion boomed within the confined space. When it had finally closed, he helped me to my feet and apologized before I could come up with a complaint. It's better to enter from this way, to see it up front for the first time. Without the evening light outside, the garage was completely dark, and my coworker told me to wait a moment while he turned on the light. I expected either the dim, barely luminate glow of a cheap bulb, or the harsh, bug-attracting brilliance of a floodlight. But instead, an eerie crimson light filled the room, casting a sanguine gloom upon everything. The objects immediately near me were ordinary: a rusted mountain bike and a pump for its tires, a few unlabeled moving boxes, gardening tools hung on rubber hooks affixed to the left wall, a long metal chest against the right wall, probably containing fishing or hunting equipment. But in stark contrast to these mundane suburban items was the thing against the far wall of the garage, above which was situated the blood-tinged light. To put it plainly, it was a head, a massive, extremely rotted head. The sheer enormity of it was what I first noticed. It spanned the entire back wall of the garage, lying on its right cheek, facing us, from its intermittently lumpy and cratered scalp to the tunnel-like stub of its neck, with the left temple almost touching the ceiling. Its skin, sallow and leprous, was taut against the skull, the physiognomy wholly unidentifiable. The second thing I noticed, and was deeply appalled by, was the advanced state of its decomposition, but not just that. but how it seemed, despite this, to live. It smoldered, or rather, perpetually moldering, skin pulsated, the pustules and gangrenous lumps throbbing hideously, undergoing an impossible inflammation. The severity of its sickness, the undeniable certainty of its death, coupled with these contradictory signs of life, reminded me of one of the more solid glimpses of that delirium-haunting figure, and I realized that I was looking at the real, physical form of that gulf-traversing emissary, the despair priest, or preacher, whichever you prefer. He appeared in my garage one day while I was watching that old TV. I'd been in a really good mood, having just finished watching a live stream of a mass from my church back home. I hadn't found a local one yet. Well, I guess my moment of triumphant spirituality caught this thing's attention. It appeared right there, simply manifested as if it had teleported from some other place. Only back then, its face hadn't yet decayed. It was still dying, but there was more life than death in it. I was of course terrified, scared out of my fucking mind, and all the joy and love for the Lord bled out of me in an instant. Dread washed over me, but the most bizarre thing was how good it felt, if that makes sense. It was intoxicating. The scale of my hopelessness somehow enthralled me. The way he spoke about the experience was almost nostalgic, and I felt my body begin to prepare for some kind of fight or flight state. His face, serene and pallid, looked deathly in the sanguine light, like a corpse reposed in an alcove within a torch-lit tomb. Not knowing how to respond, I just said, "Well, shit." He nodded, a sorrowful smile spreading across his face, and then continued. I sensed that it was dying, would have known even if I hadn't been able to see the thing. I was also somehow made aware of the fact that its purpose was to spread this dread, to fill people with a horrible, terrible despair, wherever it could find them. The dread priest, evangelizing the cosmos with intimations and images of hopelessness and nihility, but it was dying, and it couldn't fulfill this mantle completely. Had it been a little healthier, a little less eroded by rot, it would have succeeded in enrapturing me. I would have succumbed to an irremediable despair and been left to die, probably, either through self-neglect and malnutrition or self-termination. But eventually, I snapped out of it and left the garage, but the feeling still lingered. Tiny sorrow-tipped hooks had been embedded in my psyche. Happiness and optimism returned to me eventually, and initially these feelings were more potent than they had ever been before. I felt exultant in my praise for God, joyous in my existence. But these intensities quickly faded, and I was left dejected and glum. I didn't want to admit it at first, but I knew I'd have to eventually return to it. That I'd have to eventually expose myself again to that undying thing so that I could immerse myself in its unwholesome radiation in order to feel the subsequent spiritual ecstasy of its absence. It was a monstrous and darkly fantastic story, and I stared at the thing with a new level of disgust. It had come from some far-flung domain of space to spread despair, to bring civilizations to ruin not with cosmic violence or by annihilation of the dominant species, but through an emission of volatile hopelessness, a pervasive broadcast of mortal futility. Having an idea, but needing to confirm it, I asked that unspeakable, darkly revelatory question. What does this have to do with the coffee? My coworker pulled his mug from his pocket. I hadn't noticed he'd been carrying it with him, and went over to the ghoulish head. As casually as if it were a drink dispenser, he put his cup under one of the ever-seeping pores until the foul black slime filled it to the brim. Then, without a moment of hesitation, he brought the mug to his lips and took a sip. His revulsion was more powerful than I'd ever seen, and he lingered longer than usual in that state of despondent reflection. But he soon recovered and dumped the rest into the eyeless socket abreast with his shoulder. I only add a little to my morning coffee. If I were to drink a whole cup of this, I'd surely lose myself to that awful sorrow if it didn't outright kill me due to some kind of toxicity at high dosages. But yeah, that's it. I add a little to my coffee, suffer through that microdose of despair, and then spend the rest of the day feeling pretty damn good. I have to take a sip here and there. Sure, the periods can vary in length, but I'd say it's still better than just enduring life as it is. You know, even with religious optimism, life can really fucking suck, and some days it's almost intolerably hard to get up and go to work and exist. At least this way I'm chasing a state of harmless optimism and positivity rather than some ever-dwindling state of normalcy. It's even helped me feel closer to God, if you can believe it. While I doubted that final part of his claim, I saw the sense in the rest of it. I had felt good after the clearing of the despair, though I was already feeling a little low, a little deprived of my intoxicant-induced joy. I had so many questions for him. Why keep it? Why not show the authorities or scientists or try to destroy it? But as the seconds ticked by and I smelled the weird, not right scent of its ceaseless decomposition, I knew that I would have refrained from showing anyone else as well. I wanted another taste, craved the post-trauma clarity, and elation. My coworker had been granted a warped miracle, and had the same been done for me, I wouldn't have told a soul. Sensing my desire, he told me to wait there and then went into the house. A few moments later, he returned bearing 2 cups of steaming coffee. I keep my coffee maker set to brew up a batch in time for my arrival home. I like to stick to a routine with this stuff. He brought both cups under 2 separate streams of the sickeningly slushy liquid, only for a moment, and then withdrew them, their surfaces tinged with a deeper darkness than before. Smiling, he extended a cup to me, and I accepted the Stygian mix like a dying man accepting his last rites. Together we drank, despaired, and, afterwards, danced. My childhood friend is haunting me. On the first day of high school, I received a concise letter from my best friend letting me know that I was no longer cool enough to be her friend. It read not unlike a letter of termination from a job, and I later learned that it had been generic because it had been sent to 3 other people. This left me relatively friendless, and in retrospect desperate to meet new people. Maybe that's why when a girl 2 years older than me with a shaved head and drawn-on cat whiskers told me she knew me from somewhere in my second class of the day, we were immediately attached at the hip. She was loud, vibrant, and probably the most fearless person I ever met. She was weird, make no mistake there, but her eccentricities only added to her charisma. She wore a Halloween costume corset half the time and sang show tunes out loud in the hallways. I'd always been a bit of a prude, and she had told me stories about drinking and boys. I was absolutely transfixed. Her name was Veronica. It wasn't, but for the purpose of this story, it was. She got me hooked on musical theater, and I began writing songs about her. She was a firecracker, but with her high points, her beautiful unrestrained chaos came equally intense lows. And as we grew closer, as she came to need me like I needed her, 14-year-old me was woefully unprepared to help her. How do you talk someone through a pregnancy scare when you've never had a boyfriend? How do you help with abusive parents or an alcohol addiction or an eating disorder when you're just barely out of middle school? I didn't stand a chance. We went on a school field trip once and stopped at a restaurant on the way home. She ordered the smallest meal she could, and on the drive home, she admitted that if she'd been alone, she wouldn't have eaten at all. I held her, crying, in my arms. She kissed me gently, still weeping, and I was afraid. So afraid of how that kiss had made me feel, terrified of being isolated by my peers. The next day I told my friends, and to avoid suspicion my comments bordered on homophobic. I'm not proud of this, but I was clinging desperately to the hope that separating her from me would drag my peers' suspicions away. In doing so, I betrayed her at one of the worst times in her life. Our friendship recovered, but was never the same. I watched her spiral in real time, watched as happiness turned to mania, and sadness turned to depression. When I was 15 and she was 17, she told me about coke binges, about self-harm, about sleeping with men just to feel something. At some point, she got a steady boyfriend. When she told me she was hitting him, that was the last straw. I told myself I wouldn't be her friend anymore. She reached out to me repeatedly, and I stopped responding. She cut out her other friends, broke up with her boyfriend, and in early January she waited until her mom had left for work and hung herself. At the time, I'd never been to a funeral. I don't know how many I've been to now, but a crowd of actual children dressed in black and giving eulogies for another child is something that has burned itself into my memory. Her parents were there. One of them told us that her untimely death was inevitable, that by being her friend we'd simply bought them more time. I remember thinking that it was absolute bullshit. Each of us could have done something had we reached out more, had we not betrayed her. I don't even remember the school year after that. It's a time in my life that is just gone, vanished, like she did. People look at you differently when you're in mourning, act differently, especially as a teenager in mourning. People I'd never spoken to reached out to give their condolences. Looking back, I understand that it was what they thought I wanted, some kind of comfort. But I remember being frustrated by the attention and fake kinship. I remember wishing more than anything to be left alone, and I often retreated to the comfort of my bedroom just to avoid sympathy from anyone I knew. The isolation I felt was immeasurable. 4 months later, when I could speak her name without sobbing, I went back to my old notes. I went back to the ambitious musical my younger self had started writing, the one based on her, starring her. That was the first night that it started. I had fallen asleep reading my old notes and was shaken gently awake by Veronica. She looked the same as I remembered her dark shaved hair, her wild pale blue eyes. When I brought myself to look at her neck, it looked exactly as it had in life, not a single scratch on her. I was, obviously, bewildered, but I ultimately realized that accepting that she was here left me a lot happier than questioning why she would be. She smiled at me, cold hand still resting on my shoulder. Right, came a voice that sounded like wind. She hadn't opened her mouth. Silently, she picked up a paper from the stack that surrounded me, And the voice came again. Right. It was more forceful this time, more concrete, as if the first command had simply been to test her voice. And so I picked up a pencil, and I did. The song I had been working on was incomplete. I added a verse. She stayed seated at the foot of my bed, watching and still smiling. I tested our verses and choruses, made notes in the margins about characters and staging. I could swear that as I wrote, I could see her eyes glowing. When I finished the song, I went back to dreamless slumber, glancing every so often at the dead girl that sat still at the foot of my bed, still smiling. I woke the next day feeling like I hadn't slept at all, but this was nothing new. I hadn't slept well in months. I went to school and dealt with the pitying stares of my peers. In my third period, when the teacher was droning on and I couldn't bear to comprehend another word, I heard it again, clear as day. Right. I jolted upright. No one else seemed to notice the disembodied voice, but I realized that if this truly was Veronica, and what she really wanted was for me to write about her, I would oblige even if no one else heard her. I began the framework for a new song, a ballad for the character Veronica would have played. I wrote about her pain and found myself crying hot tears in class. The teacher gave me a glance that let me know they understood and dismissed me. After splashing some cold water in my face, I returned to class and paid attention to the lecture this time. That night, she was there again when I fell asleep. But different. I couldn't put my finger on it until I stood up to get my notebook and realized that she was taller than me by a good few inches. In life, she had been almost exactly my height. Maybe she had appeared as she wanted to look, but then why would she keep the shaved hair she hadn't liked? Or the body she so desperately wished to be smaller? I let it go, chalking it up to simple misremembering. I hadn't stood next to her in months, so it made sense that little details could be wrong, like her eyes just a shade too pale, or her hair a bit shorter than it had ever been. And that eerie smile, hers had always been warm, at least in death. Her smile was toothy and wide, unrelenting, a gesture of welcome with no goodwill behind it. "Can anyone other than me see you?" I asked aloud. She was utterly silent. "Is there any reason in particular you chose me?" I asked again. "Right," she commanded, and I obliged. I went back to the solo I'd been working on earlier and revised some lyrics. She seemed happy with this, eyes again seeming to glow as I fell back to sleep. It continued on for months. Any spare moment, the second my attention was not on whatever was at hand, I heard her. I trudged through junior year. I began to think of it as almost a gift. As someone who rarely has complete focus, the concept of a constant reminder to work on my project was all too enticing. I grew to appreciate her presence, feel almost comforted by it, and she grew in a different way. Every night she seemed taller, proportionate still, but bigger and bigger, towering over me. She loomed at the edge of my bed, or sitting in the chair in the corner, or once hiding in my closet. She was omnipresent, and it was a welcome distraction from my grief. Life continued on. I trudged through my junior year and wrote every night, never getting any amount of genuine sleep. I was sluggish in school, and my grades were suffering from sheer exhaustion. When I was nearly happy with my music, lyrics, and characters, I compiled them into a notebook. I gave them to the woman who now took up a whole corner of my room, and she flipped through it with her comically large hands. When she was done, her unnerving smile faltered and finally split into an equally bizarre mask of sadness. "Are you really sure you're ready to be done?" said the voice, Veronica's stretched lips unmoving from her horrible frown. I realized, with a start, two things. The first was that if I stopped writing, I would stop seeing her. The second was that she was right. The plot was one that was well written for a 14-year-old. But not by any means professional. It felt like a child's story, oversimplified and dramatic without purpose. I looked up into her ice blue eyes. I didn't remember them looking that cold in life, and took the notebook away, promising to do better. The summer before my senior year, I started on a novel. It had similar characters to the musical, but the plot had been reworked into something that I thought seemed more articulate, more clear-cut. The night I told her that I was beginning it, her wide smile seemed even larger. I could practically feel her drinking in each word I wrote as her eyes glowed at the end of each night. Friends started asking why I was spending less time with them, and I had no way to tell them that my time was being taken up writing for my friend. To what end? I had no clue. After 30,000 words, Veronica had to bend to fit in my bedroom. When she read my work at the end of each night, her smile grew somehow wider, and at this point I felt that I could very easily fit in her wide, gaping mouth. It was grotesque in a way that was almost distracting, but her face remained beautiful, just wrong, no longer human. But I guess I never assumed the entity in my room was. When I came to the final chapter, I showed her the printed out pages and she read them, sitting still for a solid hour. At the end, her even larger mouth made the disturbing grimace I remembered, and I knew what she was thinking. The writing had been good, but could always be better. The images in my head had been so clear it was easy to assume everyone understood them as I described. and I sometimes lacked the detail that made a story realistic. The dialogue had been edgy and trying too hard to sound smart. When I thought about going back through, editing the hundreds of pages, a sting of pain filled me. I was so tired, I would have given anything to get a good night's sleep. But I persisted and continued to write for her. At some point, I thought that maybe a book was the wrong format altogether. I found that dialogue without descriptions proved to be my strong suit, and I got into playwriting. I didn't write the same fictionalized account of her life, filled with fantasy, but a realistic timeline of our friendship and her death. At this point, I was in college. Each night, she filled my room, silent and smiling. Each night, I wrote tributes for her. Each night, I grew a little more afraid. The transformation had happened so slowly that it seemed natural, but she looked less and less human every day. Her eyes were blue dots in her head, her mouth an endlessly wide and toothy grin. Her face was poreless and smooth like a porcelain doll. It was disquieting, but she had motivated me to do some of my best work, and her story was the first thing I could focus on. Didn't that give her some amount of credibility? Halfway through the newest play, 4 years after her death, I couldn't take it anymore. A long breaking point, I know, but I was scared that if I took a night off, she'd leave and wouldn't come back. After 4 years, some rest would have been almost worth it. I bought a blindfold and noise-canceling headphones and wrapped myself in a cocoon of blankets. I needed to get some sleep before it literally killed me. Ominous writing deadlines be damned. The moment I drifted off, I found myself in a beautiful park surrounded by trees. I looked up to find myself sitting on a bench next to a serene and very human-looking Veronica. The thing in my room looked clownish in comparison, a very poor replacement for her. She was warm to the touch, content, and beautiful. She smiled, and I had no idea how I could call the thing's cartoonish grimace a smile. I leaned in and finally hugged her. I didn't know where to begin now that she was finally here. I asked her if she was happy, and she reassured me that she was. I asked if she had seen what was going on in the world, and she said she hadn't. I asked her how that could be when she'd been in my room every night, and this gave her pause. She looked at me in a way I'll never forget, the same way my peers had looked at me whenever they saw me for the following year. Pityingly, "Listen to me," she said. "Whatever has been visiting you is not me. I hold no grudge, keep no burden that I held in life. The thing that keeps you writing about your pain is not doing so to help me, but to feed on you. I do not want you to wallow, but to thrive." With that, she kissed my forehead and walked away. I knew that it was our final goodbye, and I made peace with it. A meaningful exit is not always a given, and until that point the only closure I'd received had been from the thing that haunted my room. The park melted away around me, and I opened my eyes to see the ghoulish portrait of Veronica making eye contact with me. Right, the voice that was not Veronica's roared, and one last time, I did. I told the story of Veronica and her beautiful impact on my life, of the sadness that followed, and of the thing that kept me wallowing in sadness and self-pity. When I was fully and completely done, I handed the thing the handwritten paper and watched it read. "Are you sure you want to end it here? Seems rather incomplete." The voice was nothing like hers. How could I have possibly believed this lie? I knew the answer was simply that I had wanted to. "Yes," I said, simply, pathetic. It cried, ripping the paper in half, clearly vying for rewrites. "I don't care," I said. "I'm going back to sleep." It looked at me with that drooping frown, practically melting off its face, and as I watched, it shrunk a foot. Poorly worded, it said, its voice a bit more panicked. It shrank again. Bizarre, just plain weird. It shrank again. "Don't quit your day job," it wailed, about my height at this point. My silence was deafening. It shot downward, smaller and smaller as its insults grew into meaningless threats and eventually just screaming. When it was small enough, I crushed it under my notebook like a bug and swept the remains into the trash. Veronica, the real Veronica, was dead. But wherever she was at peace. When I was finally able to sleep, I'd see her every so often in dreams. She looked happier than she had in life. I truly hoped she'd meant what she had said about releasing her earthly burdens. When I finally found the distinction between wallowing and honoring, for once I found myself inspired to create something new. No Sleep for the Living, Part 1. I keep waking up with cuts. I'm not talking about accidental scratches during sleep, or little abrasions that may easily be explained away. I'm talking about cuts that bleed into the mattress, deep gashes on my arms, legs, and torso. I was getting scared all over, and I had no idea why. I figured I was sleepwalking and decided to chain myself up whenever I slept. But the next day, I was uncuffed from the bed. The rod on the bed frame I handcuffed myself to was broken, and there was a note on my desk. "Please don't ever do that again. Cuff us again and you very well might not wake up in the morning." The note chilled me to my bones. The content, of course, terrified me, but what made it inexplicable was that it was written in my handwriting. As I stared at that note, frozen into place by a paralyzing fear, A whole series of movies, TV shows, and books began swirling through my mind. Was this like Memento, Moon Knight, Jekyll and Hyde? Was there an evil, violent side of me just waiting to burst through? Did it escape whenever I slept? I must have sat there for a good few minutes just staring into space, mind whirring. Heart thumping heavily, the doorbell startled me back to action, paying the pizza guy absent-mindedly. I got back to my room and began munching on the pizza in bed. Not the most hygienic thing to do, but my mind wasn't exactly in a good place. I began researching what I could do. There was lots of information online. It seemed that a lot more people were going through things like these than I would have expected. First advice I followed was to set up a camera. Luckily, I had a pet camera. I had gotten it when I first moved here a couple of years ago, fully intending to adopt a dog for company. As it turned out, it was just one of those things that I just didn't get around to doing. Part of me probably realized I was too broke to be able to take care of a dog, and too busy to be able to walk it every morning and night. I rummaged through the storage room, found it, plugged it in, and set it up. I downloaded the application needed to view its video footage through my phone, set that up as well, then aimed the pet camera at my bed. Then I placed some random books, candles, and knickknacks around it, hoping that it would make the camera less obvious. I gave myself a mental pat on the back for having purchased the pet camera with the night vision capability. Then I realized that I would need to cover more ground, as much as possible, in fact. So I headed out to get a body cam and a couple of surveillance cameras. I also bought a black light and some cans of tonic water. When I got back home, I hunted down the box of teeth whitening I remembered having bought ages ago. It took me a while to locate it in the storage room. Then I mixed it with the tonic water and wiped the mixture all over my shoes. I poured the remnant onto the mat outside my house. It should stay wet for at least a day. Just to be clear, I read that black light illuminates things like teeth whitener and tonic water, and I was hoping that the next day I would be able to pick up my footprints using the black light and see where I went. I set up the surveillance cameras in my living room, outside my house, and a little down the block, though for the one down the block, I couldn't set it up on Wi-Fi and so would have to manually retrieve it to view the footage the next day. I hid it as well as I could and could only hope that no one would find it and steal it. When I went home, I wrote on a piece of paper in a large font, "Who are you and what are you up to?" I taped the paper right on the door so whoever it was could see it before leaving the house. I also set up a portable reading lamp to shine directly onto the piece of paper. I spent the day nervously messing around the house, trying to think of more things I could do to find out what was going on. When night came and I began to feel sleepy, I began to duct tape some magazines around my torso. I read that those were great for blocking knife attacks. I taped magazines around my forearms as well. Then I clipped the body camera to my shirt and sewed the wires to my shirt for good measure. Next, I enabled the GPS on my phone and slid my phone, fully charged, into my pocket. I settled down in bed. Despite the light from the desk lamp shining on the door, the discomfort of the duct-taped magazines, and my anxiety, I soon found myself lulled to sleep by a recording of a dog snoring. I woke up the next day with my vision half blocked by a piece of paper. I pulled the tape on it off my forehead, wincing at the sting. I flipped the paper around and looked at it as my vision cleared, and saw the words, "Thanks for the zines." I looked at my arm and noticed that there was a deep cut across the magazine I had wrapped around my left forearm, splitting the pages diagonally. I sat up and felt an intense pain spring through my shoulder. I must have strained it during the night. Remembering the setup from the day before, anticipation pierced my chest, dispersing the remaining fog of sleep from my mind. I got off the bed, relieved to find that aside from the strained shoulder, everything else seemed relatively unharmed. I checked out the pet camera. It was untouched, which meant that whoever it was had come out of the bed last night had not noticed or cared to switch it off. I swiped across the pages on my phone to the pet camera app. It didn't take much scrolling before I found the footage I needed. There it was, just half an hour after I had dozed off, based on when my snoring started. I felt a chill spilling down my spine as I watched the unfamiliar movements of my body. The video showed me sitting up in the middle of the night, looking around and checking my arms and torso, uncovering my shirt to examine the magazines. It was me, but the actions were strange, a little jerky and very hurried. They seemed the actions of someone much more brusque than I was, someone paranoid and intense. I watched as I nodded my head and smirked, seemingly approving of the magazines I had taped around my body. I watched as my body got out of bed, then walked to the door. Here, my body, or okay, I'm just going to call whoever was using my body, it, for clarity's sake. So it stared at the paper on the door, then chuckled. It opened the door, not bothering to respond to my message. I couldn't help but feel irked. Such inconsiderate behavior for someone who was borrowing my body in my sleep. I activated the apps for the surveillance camera and grabbed my black light. The footage showed me getting out of the house and head down the road. I walked out to grab the surveillance camera I had placed down the road and rushed back to plug the camera into my computer. Once I had access to the footage, I quickly scrolled to the time it would have walked by, around 1 a.m. The footage showed it walking for a distance before turning left and disappearing out of the camera's view. I scrolled further and saw it returning from the same direction at around 5:45 a.m. I used the black light to try to trace where it might have gone past that turning, but the visible traces of its footprints reached only a couple steps past the turn. Damn it, in the future, I would have to somehow make a puddle of the teeth whiten tonic water mixture at the start. Undeterred, I scrolled through the GPS locations of my phone. The GPS data confirmed what the camera footage had shown. I know it's a little overkill, but I just wanted to make sure that it didn't fake the GPS location data. Having different sources of information to cross-reference stuff was a habit I have had for a long time. The GPS data showed that it had wandered off the road near the woods. Of course, where would a creepy body stealer go in the middle of the night? To the creepiest woods in town. Of course, I sighed, knowing that I wouldn't be able to resist going to check out its route. I pulled up the footage from the body cam. It showed my body walking down the path the other cameras had shown, though the first-person view made the surrounding night seem scarier, more menacing. I scrolled forward until the part where it entered the woods. I saw lots of trudging through the dense growth of the woods, and my hand reaching forward here and there to push leaves and branches aside, as if checking for something on the trees. I paused the footage and replayed a section, having caught sight of something. There it was, my hand pulling aside a branch to reveal a small spot of red paint. It was too bright to be dried blood, on a tree. Here and there, the camera view showed spots of red paint on trees at intermittent periods. It was probably a trail of markings meant to guide whoever was using my body somewhere. Finally, the view changed. From the seemingly endless mass of green, brown, and gray, there emerged a tiny clearing, one that seemed unnaturally empty and hollow, scratched out in the midst of the lush growth of vegetation. It stopped for a while, staring at that patch of lifeless ground. Then the camera view swiveled and its face appeared on the screen. My face. "You shouldn't see this," it said in my voice, but its intonation and rhythm made it sound like a completely different person. My gut twisted at the mix of familiarity and strangeness the voice held. The screen went dark. I sat in silence, numb with dread. It knew I was watching, and it let me be. What was in the clearing? I had half a mind to stop pursuing things right there, to perhaps see a doctor, get some medication that could keep my body from moving at night. Perhaps this was all just me sleepwalking that led to an elaborate, complex series of actions. There had to have been similar cases. A quick search online quickly squashed my hopes. Sleepwalking could get really wild, like people waking up to find themselves driving somewhere in the middle of the night. But I found no instances of the sleepwalker being that aware of their surroundings, to the point of being able to seek out trail markers, realizing that they are being recorded and leaving notes and messages for themselves to read or see while awake. A huge part was also that I just couldn't see it as just sleepwalking. It didn't explain how I got out of my cuffs, how I got back to bed each time, and why I acted so differently on the footage. I had to find out what was going on. I had to check out that clearing, get to the bottom of things. I went home to stock up on things that I'd need. I retaped magazines around my limbs and torso, and tucked a Swiss Army knife into my pocket. I didn't have any cooler knives that could be easily carried around without attracting attention. I found my winter gloves and tucked them in my backpack. I found a mini garden shovel and a torchlight and packed them too. I recharged the body cam and scheduled an email to be sent to my only friend in this place, the only one I trusted. Anyway, the user login and password to access the footage from the body cam was in that email. Just in case I didn't get back by 10 p.m. tonight, the email would be sent out and my friend would be able to know what happened to me. I soon ran out of things to delay my journey. Reluctantly, I strapped on the backpack and clipped on the body cam, then headed out the door. I soon reached the start of the woods where my body had entered last night. Despite playing the footage over and over again, it proved ridiculously difficult to trace the route that it had taken last night. After spending nearly 3 hours wandering around trying to follow the path shown on the footage, I was ready to give up. Then, I lifted a sagging branch and spotted a red paint mark on a tree. My heart pumped with adrenaline. There it was. I was on track. It took at least another hour for me to find the rest of the red paint marks that led me to the clearing. Stepping into that small barren space, tentacles of dread twined their way up my spine. I knelt down to examine the ground, swiping about in sand and mud. There seemed to be nothing out of the ordinary. I pulled the mini shovel out and dug around for a bit. It seemed to be nothing but soil for the first few inches. I was beginning to think that perhaps there was nothing more to the clearing when I heard it. Some muffled cries from beneath. My throat constricted, and my heart began to pound. I began to dig in earnest, desperately shoveling up soil and mud. The cries became clearer. I was able to make out a few words, what sounded like, "No, leave me alone, help." Around a meter down, my shovel hit something hard. I cleared the soil and mud away from the hard surface and uncovered what looked like a trapdoor. It was locked. Staring at the mud-caked padlock, I wondered where the other me could have hidden a key. Considering how it was using my body, it had to have the key on me, in my room, or somewhere easily accessible. The footage didn't show it retrieving any key, and I hadn't found anything on me either. The key had to be around here. I looked around, unsure where to begin the search. I stared at the trapdoor, wondering if I could somehow break the lock and pry it open. That was when I noticed a faint outline of a key on the top left corner of the trapdoor. I ran my finger over the key shape. The key was fitted into the trapdoor, I realized. A near-perfect fit, showing just the faintest traces of its seams. I pulled out my Swiss Army knife and pried the key loose after a few tries. I listened to the continued cries from within, my gut brimming with fear. Trembling, I fumbled with the key for a full minute before I managed to insert it into the keyhole. "No, please, no more, please." The voice kept wailing. I took a deep breath, held the shovel in one hand, and turned the key in the lock. A loud click temporarily silenced the cries. I reached out and placed one hand on the handle, braced myself, then pulled. The trapdoor was heavy, but opened easily enough. It must have been opened recently. I looked down to see a ladder. The voice was loud and clear now. "Please, stop hurting me. Please just stop." I started nervously down at the area lit by the square of light from the trapdoor entrance. "Hello," I called down. "Just stop." The voice rang out, followed by loud sobs. Carefully, I stuck one leg down onto the first rung of the ladder. It held my weight. When nothing happened, I placed my other leg down to the next rung. Nothing happened, and the voice stopped. I scurried down the rest of the ladder and turned hurriedly to face the direction where the voice had come from. Holding the shovel out in one hand, I reached the other to the side of my backpack and pulled out the torchlight I had packed. I shone it around. I froze when the round beam of light skimmed across a figure in the corner. I pointed the light back at whatever it was that I had seen and steeled myself. A dark figure crouched at the corner, huddled up and shaking. I squinted, trying to make out its form and shape. It was a young man, dirtied, disheveled, with clothes torn and stained with what seemed like patches of blood. His left eye was swollen shut, and there were cuts on his arms. He was tied up, chained to the wall. He looked up, and the haunted look in his eyes chilled my heart. "Who are you?" I asked, a tremble in my voice. "Just stop. No more games. Please, just let me go, or kill me," he said. "Who are you? Who did this to you?" I asked, not daring to move any closer. He stared at me, a desperate expression on his face. "Stop it, please." I took a tentative step forward, and he flinched, covering his head and leaning back against the wall. "Stop what? What's going on here? Who did this to you?" I asked. He continued to cower away from me for a few seconds, then slowly lifted his head. He looked fearfully at the puzzlement and shock on my face and seemed to study me for a few more moments. "You aren't playing games. You really don't know what's going on?" he asked timidly. I nodded. He stared at me for a long moment, then spoke again. "You are not Marlene." I frowned, confused. "Marlene? No, I'm Jody." A look of understanding dawned on his face. "You're Jody. You're the real person, the real owner of your body," he said, hoping to begin to fill his tone. He lunged toward me and stopped, constrained by the chains. I took a few steps back, startled. "You've got to save me, please, before Marlene comes back." His tone was urgent, pleading. "Who's Marlene? Why are you here?" I asked, looking up at the entrance. There was a mania in his expression that scared me. "Marlene, she's the one who takes over your body. She took us all. She hurt us. She killed the others, using your body. We didn't recognize her at first," he cried. "Please, let me go. Free me, please. I don't know what you're talking about. Why would she? Why my body? What are you saying?" My mind was reeling in shock, unable to process much of what he was saying. "You appeared before us a few days ago. You told us you needed help. Your dog had fallen in a hole in the woods. You lured us here, knocked us out somehow, trapped us. You told us you were Marlene, back to get us, using her body, your body, Marlene's spirit. She takes over your body." His words tumbled forth like a torrent. "That's crazy," I said, interrupting the flow of jumbled words. "You're saying there's a spirit called Marlene who takes over my body, that she used my body to get you guys, whoever you are, to trap you here, that she killed other people with my body?" "Yes," she told us. "We have never talked to you as you, only always as her, in your body. Why would she want to do this to you? Why would she kill the others with you?" if what you said was true, and how would someone in my body be able to take down you and whomever else? I asked, still incredulous. She seemed to have supernatural strength when she was the one in control. She killed my brother and my dad. She left me here to torture me. She's going to kill me. Please, let me go. The earnest terror in his voice got to me. I took a few hesitant steps forward and saw the hope and anticipation rise within him. I paused, just a few steps away. What are you waiting for? He snapped, a touch of hysteria lacing his voice. I stepped back, shocked. I'm sorry, he said. I'm just so scared. Please, let me go. Save me. His voice was soft and pleading. I softened and took a step closer to him, then another. Why did she do this to you? I asked, watching his face carefully. I saw a flicker of resentment and guilt cross his face. I don't know. I have no idea. She's insane. She's dangerous. Please, just cut me free. He begged. I stared at him and couldn't help but hesitate again. That was when he lunged at me. I stumbled back, narrowly avoiding his grasping hands. I'm sorry. Please, I just want you to set me free. I just really need you to save me. His voice broke with emotion. I stayed where I was. I was beginning to feel extremely uneasy, more so than I was already. Anyway, something seemed a little off about him. Maybe it was the way he spoke. Maybe it was his mannerisms or his expressions, but I felt a sudden wave of mistrust towards him. What's her full name? I asked. I needed to know. I needed something to research, to find the truth. He was silent. If you don't tell me her full name, who she is, I'm leaving right now, and I'll never come back here. Not me. I tried to steal my tone as much as possible to convey my determination to him. He stared at me, a tinge of hatred seeping into his face before he resumed a fearful expression. Marlene Toa, he spat out. T-O-A, yes. He nodded. I nodded in response and turned to leave. Wait, you have to free me, please. He cried out, voice breaking with terror. I strode on, refusing to look back. Stop. Don't leave me here. She'll kill me. I climbed up the ladder, ignoring his screams. At the top, I turned and said, I'll go check things out. If things make sense, if you're telling the truth, I'll come back and free you. Just give me a while. There won't be time. She'd be back by night. Please, don't do this. I shut the trapdoor, muffling his voice. Hard thudding, I began shoveling the soil back to hide the trapdoor. I checked the time. It was around 3:30 p.m. Funny, it felt like days had gone by since I woke up this morning. If I tried my best to stay awake, I probably had a full 15 to 20 hours to figure out a plan before I fell prey to sleep again. I walked away from the muted cries, taking the trapdoor key with me. Marlene Toa, I needed to find out who she was, what happened to her, why she took them, killed them, tortured him. Above all, why me? No sleep for the living. Part 2. When I got home, I unwrapped the magazines from my body and felt a great relief at the sudden absence of discomfort. I brewed as strong a cup of coffee as I could manage, gulped it down, and immediately got to researching. Marlene Toa, I typed into Google. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. I keyed in her name again, together with the name of my town, and nothing. Marlene Toa. It somehow seemed familiar, now that I had calmed down and had time to register it properly, but I couldn't connect it to any memory, any piece of information. Saying her name brought up that sense of familiarity, but I kept banging into a mental wall when I tried to figure out why. Or perhaps it just seemed familiar because I had been repeating it to myself the whole way back. Frustrated by the lack of results, I left the house. If online systems failed me, maybe I'd find something offline. I'd head to the library first, check out old news articles, the history of our town, and so on. Our town is not up to date on much. I wouldn't be surprised if there were old archives that had not been digitized or uploaded yet. I sometimes suspect that many people in this town are Neo-Luddites. Anyway, if my library quest failed, I figured I'd simply ask around at all the establishments in town. I drank another cup of coffee before leaving the house, just in case. It was the usual librarian I would see at the library. She greeted me with a pleased smile. Hey, haven't seen you in a while. I smiled back. I need some help. I'm searching for anything to do with a particular person, likely in this town. Oh, okay, who is it? And what type of information are you looking for? She assumed her usual brisk, efficient manner. Marlene Toa, I want to know who she is. The librarian paused and looked at me for a moment, a slight frown creasing her brows. Now, why do I find that familiar? She thought for a moment, then raised her eyebrows. Oh, Marlene Toa, the missing woman. The missing woman. I echoed, anticipation rising. Somewhere in my mind, something clicked. Yes, I believe she went missing around 2 years ago. Yes, I filed the newspaper articles and the missing persons poster somewhere here. Hold on, let me look it up. She typed into the computer for a while, frowned, then pulled up a huge folder from a drawer. I knew it. I thought I knew the research would have to be old school. She flipped through the pages for a while, humming, squinting over her glasses before her eyes lit up. There it is. All right, follow me. I'll show you where the stuff is. I walked along with her to a quiet little room in the library where there were shelves of little folders labeled with handwritten stickers. She mumbled as she ran a finger along the folders, then pulled one out with a flourish. It should be in here somewhere, she said. I thanked her, a bubble of admiration popping up at her efficiency and work pride that had remained throughout all these years as a librarian. Once alone, I flipped through the folder until I got to what I needed. Her face leapt out at me from a copy of the missing poster that was put up all over town. I immediately recognized her. She was all over town for a couple weeks a few years back. I had just associated her face with the word missing and not her name. After all, her photograph was the main focus of those posters. Her name was probably lost in the description. I had never looked at one carefully, up close. In fact, I had taken extra care to not look at those posters, and that was because of the guilt that I felt. Looking at her face now, the guilt that had niggled away at me 2 years back came rushing back to the surface. And with what I knew about her using my body now, the guilt was intensely magnified. No, I didn't do anything to her, just to make that clear. But that was the problem. I didn't do anything. I had seen her the day before she went missing. I had ventured out that night, disrupting my usual routine of library, park, and home. I work from home, and I like to head to the library just to have some differentiation between work and leisure hours, after which I would head to the park, sit at a quiet corner and have my packed dinner. These days, I often skip the library, though it was getting pretty crowded, and that took away a lot of its charm. I often stay home nowadays and get my work done in a designated work area. I'm not someone who goes out much, and I'm not exactly social. I think in this town, probably 3 or 4 people would recognize me and say hi. So that night, it had taken almost all of my energy and willpower to make myself take a step out of my comfort zone. I had listened to some podcast about how insanity was doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results, and being inspired to implement some change in my life. If I wanted more from life, I needed to do more, I told myself firmly, and that was how I found myself at the local bar, trying to work up the courage to speak to the rather imposing bartender to order a drink, all the while repeating just one drink and I can go in my head like a mantra as I gathered my courage and tried to signal to get the bartender's attention. A booming voice sounded next to me. "A beer for this lady, kind sir." The bartender immediately turned around, stared at the speaker, then at me, and nodded. I looked at the source of the booming voice that commanded attention so easily. He was a man who seemed to be in his mid-40s, with a grizzled face half cloaked in a massive beard and mustache combination. He had a jolly demeanor, but something felt a little off about him. His eyes glinted with just a little too much energy, bordering on mania. He stared straight at me, a huge smile on his face, but one that did nothing to alleviate the unstable energy in his eyes. I wanted to thank him, but at the same time, I was struggling with a whole host of emotions. Firstly, there was gratitude at anyone bothering to help me order a drink, but at the same time, I also felt annoyance, fear, and a sense of dread. Annoyance, because I had not wanted a beer. I had wanted a gin and tonic, and I was rather put off by his presumptuous order. Fear and dread, because I didn't know what it meant to have him call out for a beer for me. Was he buying me a drink? Do I assume that? Do I insist on paying him? Do I pretend that I was sure he was only ordering it for me, that I would be paying for it? If he was insisting on buying me a drink, what did he expect from me in return? Would I have to be nice to him, friendly, trade life stories? Would I be able to just down the drink and leave? Did I have to make friends? Do I buy him another drink back? I'm guessing I don't have to say it, but I shall anyway. Yes, I'm an overthinker, and I'm easily anxious. It really explains why I don't get out much, yay. With all these thoughts and emotions whirling through my head, I just stared at him, unable to form a sentence. "You're welcome," he said, bursting into a bellowing laughter that smacked me in the soul. It was the type of boisterous energy that I often admired in others, yet when faced with it in close quarters, I would often feel almost physically repelled by. I forced a smile, and before I could speak, he gestured to a table nearby. "There's my boys," he said, pointing out 2 young men, who smiled and stared at me, their expressions unreadable. "You're joining us. You young people can hang out," he announced confidently. I felt my heart drop to the floor. This was not at all what I was prepared for. I could feel my face turning pale as cold sweat began to form on my forehead and my palms. The bartender placed a pint of beer in front of me just then. I wanted to think of an excuse to leave, but my brain was blanking. "I'll have this beer." A lady settled herself down next to me and grabbed the beer. She seemed a little older than I was, and she radiated an inspiring mix of bubbliness, confidence, and toughness. "Hey, get this lady whatever drink she wants, on my tab," she yelled to the bartender. Then she turned to me and smiled. "Thanks for the beer. All right now, that beer wasn't for you," the man said, stepping forward a step. The lady, whom I now know to be named Marlene, stood up and faced him square on. "Oh dear, how about I join you and your boys instead? I can be a hoot," she said. The words were friendly enough, but she managed to make it sound like a threat. I hovered nearby, unsure what to do, anxiety crawling up my throat. So I was incredibly relieved when she turned back to me and said, loudly enough for the man to hear, "You don't seem to want to be here. Don't worry, if you want to, you can leave now. I can handle this." I stared at her with gratitude, smiled shakily and nodded, then hightailed it out of the bar. That was the first and last time I had ever seen Marlene. A few days later, the missing posters were everywhere. I had felt a terrible sense of dread, which I quickly squashed and blocked out. I had already tended to avoid watching the news on TV or reading the newspapers, as I was of the view that the world is already difficult and tough enough as it is, without having the horrible events in the world shoved right in my face. But after seeing the missing posters and recognizing the lady from that night on them, I made it a point to avoid coming into contact with news of any kind. A part of me was terrified at the thought that perhaps she had gotten into trouble because of me. The rest of my mind had beat that thought into submission and shoved it in a locker. I couldn't help but keep thinking that perhaps I should report the incident to the police. That thought haunted me for about 2 days before I'd overheard someone at the library talking about the missing woman and saying that she had most likely left town to avoid paying the rent on her place, which had apparently piled up over the past months. She was also in debt, someone had whispered in a salacious tone to a few people in town. I remember a surge of relief washing over me then. She hadn't been harmed. She had likely left town. Maybe that was why she had been so daring and straightforward with those men. She knew she would be leaving anyway, and that was all the thought I had put into Marlene Toa. I felt ashamed. Now, looking at her picture, I hadn't even bothered to learn her name. Here she was, using my body during my sleep, doing things to these people. She had obviously met with a terrible fate, somehow. Yet I had chosen to cling on to the rumors that she had left town to avoid her debts, just so I could feel better about not speaking out, so that I could not feel guilt about her standing up for me, and me just leaving the bar without a word. That guy in the woods. I strove to remember the faces of the 2 young men at the bar. The sons of that man who had bought a beer for me. Was the trapped guy one of them? I couldn't, for the life of me, picture the faces of the young men. It was one incident, 2 years or so ago, something I had put out of my mind for a long time. I checked the time at this point. It was almost 6 p.m. at this point. I could feel the stress of the day's events weighing on me, draining my mind and body. I left the library and headed to a nearby cafe to get a triple shot espresso. Once the caffeine was in my system, I grabbed a pen from my bag and began scribbling on the serviette. Marlene Toa, I wrote and underlined at the top of the serviette. Below, I wrote down, in point form, missing and likely dead. Then, looking around to make sure no one was looking in my direction, I wrote, possessing my body while I sleep and killed 2 people, trapped 1. Thinking for a bit, I added, maybe the 3 taken are the same father and sons I saw in the bar. After all, the young man had said that she had killed his dad and brother. The most likely story I could think of was that Marlene had been killed by the father and sons at the bar. She was probably using my body to hunt them down, as vengeance. But why me? Maybe I was supposed to die that day. Maybe I had been the intended victim, and her stepping in had caused her to die in my place. She must hate me. Dear God, maybe she had taken my body to kill them, to frame me for murder. 2 birds, 1 stone. She gets the guys who killed her and frames the one who let her die in her stead. I let her die in my stead. I got her killed, and I never even went to the police. I just told myself a convenient story and forgot all about her. It was karma. This was my karma. I sat back and closed my eyes, feeling hot tears prickle behind my lids. Do not cry in public, I thought. Don't lose it. I surreptitiously wiped the tears that trickled out, disguising it by yawning and rubbing my eyes. I stared at the words on the serviette. That story made sense. But now that I knew, what the hell was I supposed to do? Perhaps I should just let her do what she wants with my body, get her revenge, on them, on me, then let her go in peace. As I faced the music for my part in her death, but a part of me railed against that thought. The same part of me that has repeatedly refused to give up on me, to just let things be. A spark that refused to die. Maybe the story was all wrong. I couldn't be sure. For all I knew, that incident at the bar and the father and his sons had nothing to do with Marlene going missing. I had to know for sure before I decided on anything. I had to go to the bar. It was a long shot, but perhaps the bartender was the same guy. Perhaps he knew something. It was near 8 p.m. by the time I had settled down at the bar counter and chugged a gin and tonic to fuel my courage to talk to the bartender, who thankfully was the same one I remembered from that night so long ago. "Do you know Marlene?" I asked, out of the blue and without any preamble. I winced internally. Not the best start. The bartender stared at me, a look of surprise and recognition on his face. "Yay, why?" he asked, voice gruff, suspicious. "I don't know if you remember this, but around 2 years ago, I was here. Someone had bought me a beer. Marlene had helped me out. I was uncomfortable. She grabbed the beer instead and asked me to leave. I wasn't putting across the story as well as I could have. I got frustrated with myself. What the hell was wrong with me that I couldn't explain a simple scenario?" He frowned. 2 years is a long time, but yes, I remember that incident. He looked at me, his face now inked with curiosity. "You're that girl?" "Yes, I haven't seen you around since." "Do you remember the man who bought the beer and his 2 sons?" I asked. His frown deepened. "Why? What's it matter?" He seemed wary again. "I need to know who they are," I said, looking at him pleadingly. He stayed silent. I think Marlene is. I stuttered, and in my anxiety and mess of a mental state, I began to tear again. "Shit," I thought. "Crybaby, get it together," I admonished myself. He took one look at my face, and his countenance softened. "Hey, you okay?" He grabbed some serviettes from behind the bar and passed them to me. I felt my face flush, and I looked down, not daring to face any of the judgmental stares that I was sure I was attracting. "I just need to know who they are. I think they hurt Marlene," I forced out in as soft a voice I could muster so that no one else would hear. The bartender looked taken aback. "Hey, you can't go around saying things like that," he began. "Please, I think she died because of me. Because she helped me," I interrupted him. The tears continued. I no longer bothered to wipe them. The wiping was probably attracting more attention than the tears themselves. "Oh shit, lady, no, that's what you think." He looked at me, then gestured for me to head out with him. He called for someone in the bar to take over for him for a bit. I looked resolutely at the ground as we walked toward the exit, hoping desperately that no one was looking at me. We stepped out into the cold air, and he took out a cigarette. I turned down the cigarette he offered me. "What happened with Marlene? No one knows," he said, lighting up his cigarette. "To be honest, when she went missing soon after that incident, I had my doubts about the Tobers too. That guy and his sons." I stared at him, hanging on to each word. "The whole thing really made an impression. After you left that night, Marlene sat down at their table, and the 2 young Tobers seemed really uncomfortable. Their dad was pissed. I wanted to tell Marlene to leave it, that she had made her point, but I didn't have to. She seemed to think the same and returned to her table. But then the Tobers kicked up a fuss, said they weren't paying for her beer. Marlene made some point about them having bought the beer for you, and you having let her have it, something like that. Anyway, words were exchanged. I just put the beer on the house to avoid any more shit going down." He took a long drag on his cigarette, then continued. "The Tobers seem like odd folks, but I figured they're harmless. I told the police about the incident though. Seemed weird that Marlene would disappear so soon after that. But don't tell anyone that," he said. "The police questioned and cleared them, from what I know, so don't hold it against yourself." He looked sincere in his concern. I felt a rush of shame well up. He had gone to the police. As just a bystander, an observer, he had gone to the police with that information. But I hadn't. I had chickened out and lied to myself to avoid doing the right thing. At the same time, I felt relieved. He had told the police. This meant that my report wasn't needed. The situation had been made known to the police, and they had cleared the Tobers. I stared into space for a while, trying to cope with the rush of emotions. He stood awkwardly before me, finishing his cigarette. We were silent for the next few minutes. Then he patted my arm awkwardly and headed back into the bar. I got home and continued to just sit there, digesting everything that I had learned. The gin and tonic turned out to be a bad idea. Combined with the crazy array of emotions that had gone through me, it brought on a heavy sense of weariness that I was afraid I would not be able to combat for long. Finally, I began composing a letter. As I wrote "Dear Marlene," I got curious. Why was the note she wrote to me in my handwriting? I got worried. Was this all a story in my head, and I had actually sleepwalked myself into murder charges? I pushed that thought from my mind. Maybe it was muscle memory. After all, she was using hands that had been writing in a certain way for so many years. I continued writing. "I think I know what happened. You were killed by the Tobers, weren't you? and I just stood by, doing nothing, not reporting the whole incident with them and you in the bar. I'm so sorry. I thought you left town on your own. There was talk about you leaving to escape debt. I think I wanted to believe that more than anything else. I didn't want to feel guilty, but now I know. You were killed by the Tobers, probably for rescuing me. Maybe I was supposed to die instead. I get why you want revenge on them and me. Why did you choose my body? I get it. I wish I did more. I wish I stayed. I wish I reported it. I began to cry again at this point, a tear or two wetting the paper and smudging a letter or two. I ignored it. It was still legible. I don't want to be a murderer. I don't want to have my life ruined like this. I'm selfish, I know. I'm sorry, but please, could you not kill him? Could we let things be? I swear to you I'll try to make things up somehow. Maybe I'll help other women. I'll stand up for others. I'll do charity. I'll help out any family or friends you want me to. Please, just let me have my life back. Please, I'm sorry. I stopped writing then and just curled up as my body was racked with sobs. I wept for a long time and then exhaustion overcame me. I slept. When I woke up, my entire body ached. My back felt like it was on fire whenever I moved. My fingers were covered with dirt and blood. Was it mine? Was it someone else's? Dread bloomed in my heart. I looked over at the table. The letter I had written was still there. There was no response, no note left behind. I felt my heart plunge. She hadn't accepted my apologies. She didn't change her mind. I stared at the abrasions and cuts on my hands and wondered what these hands had done last night. There was a fierce burning in my arms too whenever I reached out to grab something or to support myself. I felt almost petrified with terror. What did she do? I grabbed a carton of milk from the fridge and some slices of cheese. I put them in my backpack and left the house, not bothering to shower or change. I didn't care anymore. I was about to head off the road to go back into the woods when I just stopped moving. I couldn't do it. I couldn't face whatever it was that had happened last night. I couldn't deal with this mess, this insanity anymore. I couldn't do it. I sat down by the side of the road and ignored a car that went by, honking at me and a passenger asking if I was all right. I must have just sat there for a good 10 minutes, my mind and body shut down. Then I slowly got to my feet. I wouldn't have to deal with this anymore. Not alone. No, I would face whatever I had to face, but this was no longer going to be my secret horror. I walked on the road, away from the woods. I kept on walking until I found myself in front of the police station. I walked right in and sat down in front of an officer who looked alarmed at the state I was in. I must have been a sight, with soil all over my body and clothes, hair messed up, dried blood on my hands, and scratches everywhere. I tried to answer his questions, tried to speak, but it felt like someone had stuffed cotton down my throat. I couldn't force the words out. The more I panicked, the denser the cotton in my throat got. In the end, I just sat there, tearing, unable to speak. I finally grabbed the sleeve of the police officer and stood up to lead him out. Looking bewildered, he followed me, gesturing for a colleague to go with us. I just walked, ignoring their incessant questions, the looks of bemusement on the faces of passers-by, and the cold wind which seemed to blow right through my bones. I had forgotten to wear a coat, I realized somewhere in my befuddled mind. I kept walking until we got to the spot in the woods after I had tracked down the red paint marks. They were much easier to spot the second time around. The officers with me were beginning to look worried and alarmed. One of them drew his weapon and kept it by his side, at the ready. I found the clearing. I knelt down and began to dig with my hands. Having forgotten the shovel, the police officers stood back. Then one of them knelt down to help me. He found a rock and used it to dig as well. They had stopped asking questions by then. They must have figured I wouldn't answer no matter what they asked. How they asked. The other officers stood on guard and alert. I kept digging and digging, but there was nothing, no trapdoor to be found. Had I gone insane? Did I dream up the whole thing? Before relief could spring forth, my hand hit a hard surface. There it was. I swiped around it and soon realized that it was the wall of the hidden space beneath. I kept digging and soon hit the rungs of the ladder. The entire space had been filled in, I realized. Covered over, buried with soil. The last Tober guy, he must be gone. The officers looked alarmed by then. They called someone, and soon more people came, with proper shovels and digging equipment. I just sat at the side, watching, still unable to speak, unable to respond to anything the officers said. A heavy dread squeezed my insides. I felt like I could barely breathe. In a matter of an hour or so, they had uncovered the entire small space within, the part once covered by the trapdoor, which had mysteriously disappeared. Nothing was there. They found not a single scrap of clothing, no chains, no ties, no bones, no blood, nothing. They kept questioning me, even after they had brought me back to the station. A doctor came to check me out. Still, I was unable to say a word. Finally, someone offered me a pen and a notepad. I sleepwalked here. I woke up, and I think I remembered something bad happening here. I don't know, maybe it was a dream, I wrote. Loud chatter ensued as the officers discussed what I had written. They asked lots of questions, like how I had known of the little crawl space in the woods, what I saw, what bad thing happened, but I kept quiet. In the end, I repeatedly wrote, I think it was just a bad dream. I don't know how I ended up there. With just that, the officers had to let me go. They seemed to be beginning to think it was some sort of weird sleepwalking incident, that perhaps I had known of that space as a kid and forgotten about it. They made up all sorts of explanations, I'm sure. When I got home, I finally noticed a new video on my mobile phone. I clicked on it, and my face appeared. The me in the video was seated in the familiar hunched position I tended to fall into whenever seated. Then she straightened up. Hey, Marlene here. I'm guessing you know all about what happened, she said, in my voice but in a different prosody. She adjusted her position again. Wow, you really hunch a lot, huh? You should sit up straight more, she said, sounding like a concerned older sister. You got the most part right, she said, and began drumming her fingers on the table. She caught herself and stopped, flattening her hands on the table. Your body keeps falling back into its own rhythms and habits. That explains the handwriting, I thought to myself, absent-mindedly. The robbers killed me, she said, her lips, my lips, pulling back, forming a thin line. They were up to no good. I sensed at the moment that man approached you. That's why I stepped in. Her eyes darkened, and a look of pure hatred flashed in her gaze. They got to me that night, as I was almost home. The bastards got me. She seemed to be overflowing with rage and disdain. Then she pulled herself together. I won't talk about what they did. But yes, they killed me. But what you got wrong, young lady, was the part about you. Here, she adjusted the phone's camera and looked straight into it. I'm not using your body for revenge. I don't hate you. What am I, stupid? Why would I blame the other almost victim for these barbaric fuckers' actions? I looked at the sincerity on her face, on my face, and felt a wave of disbelief. She didn't blame me. How could she not? They wanted to hurt you, I knew. And then they hurt me. That is not on you. You know why I went after them, used your body to do so, after all this time. Here, she scowled, a glower in her eyes. I was around them for a long time. I couldn't seem to move on. But I couldn't seem to do anything to them, either, until one day, they began to track you again. I was there, and I watched as they regained their interest in you. They remembered you from that night. They were watching you at the library, watching you go to the park for your dinners, watching you go home in the evening. They were watching you, writing down your schedule, and I knew they were going to do something to you too. You didn't even notice. Seriously, lady, get some wits about you. Look around once in a while. You are ridiculously easy to follow. I felt a cold fluid sensation settle in the pit of my stomach. They were following me. I didn't get an inkling of that. Fear seeped in around my neck and I looked around my room, suddenly paranoid. They had followed you home last week and I finally had enough. I tried to reach you. I tried to wake you, call to you, but you couldn't hear me. I was desperate, so I grabbed you, tried to reach you in your dreams or something. That was when I took over, when I realized I was you. I was controlling your body. My mouth hung open and I felt my mind raise a white flag at this point. I just couldn't think anymore, couldn't try to make sense of anything. All my mind could do was to passively register what was going on. No more reasoning. It was done. I knew I had to stop them. I knew about that trapdoor in the space there. I found it when I was a kid. I figured it was someone's long-forgotten bomb shelter or secret drug hiding place or something. Anyway, it seemed completely unused for years, and no one ever came near that area. So I treated it as my secret hangout spot for a while, and made those markings on the trees. Until I get older. Okay, I digress. I waited until they left. Then I went to find that place, using your body. I cleared the earth off the trapdoor and tried to lift the lid. It took a while. After those years untouched, I got banged up pretty badly. Sorry about that. The next night, I came and took over your body again. They had followed you home again and were just watching. It was easy enough to lure them there. I just left your house when they were still outside and headed right there at a run. They came after me, not very stealthily at that. They didn't even bother keeping a proper distance. They must have thought they had struck the lottery, with me running into the desolate woods of my own accord. They followed. I was enraptured by this point and had to remind myself to breathe. Anyway, they lost track of me for a bit in the woods. I got there first, lifted the lid, made it look like I had gone inside. then hit Closeby. Once they had gone in, I ran out and shut the trapdoor on them. Here, she smiled, a cold, cruel smile. You don't have to know the rest. She leant back and seemed to relax. Now, all you need to know is that you're safe. None of the Tobers will be bothering you anymore, or anyone else, for that matter. And don't worry, you're not going to be in trouble. I hid everything, got rid of everything, she said in a tone full of meaning. She stared into the camera for a few moments longer, then smiled, a sudden softness in her expression. I'm going off now. Your body's been through a lot. I probably strained it beyond what it would normally be able to do. Think you should just sleep it out for a while. Take care, Jody. It was nice meeting you. Here, she reached forward toward the screen and the video ended. I sat in silence for a long time, letting myself absorb the full weight of what she had said. A deep undercurrent of gratitude swept over me. Marlene Toa, I wouldn't forget her. I lay back down on my bed and shut my eyes and got the first proper sleep I had had in days. I was a nurse at a psychiatric hospital back in 1995. In the summer of '95, after graduating from nursing school, I was hired at a nearby psychiatric hospital, which I'll call Dover's for privacy reasons. At the time, I was living in the New England area. And let me tell you, the summers there were beautiful. Anyway, due to budget cuts and deplorable conditions, there were even rumors of several doctors performing lobotomies back in the 30s and 40s. Dover's was slated to close in September of that year. At the time of my hiring, though, most of the 500 patients living at the Dover's were either released or relocated to other hospitals, leaving only about 100 patients behind with 17 staff members, including 3 doctors and 4 nurses, including myself. Now, Dover's itself was a very grand hospital with its Gothic-style architecture, and while it was open, was the talk of the town, both good and bad. Dover's was located on the edge of town and was surrounded by very dense woods with only one road leading in and out. Built in 1870, it was originally intended to house 200 patients with the purpose of treating the criminally insane, mentally ill, and people suffering from tuberculosis in order to cure them. Unfortunately, though, over the years, as the population grew, overcrowding was a big issue, and by the 32nds there were upwards of 3,000 patients at the hospital at any given time. Soon though, due to the overcrowdedness, lack of funding, and staff shortages, the hospital fell into disrepair. My job at the hospital was to watch over the remaining patients until they were relocated, about 2 months. As I previously mentioned before, there were 17 staff members left with a total of 5 floors being occupied. There were 3 doctors, 4 nurses, 2 CNAs, 4 security guards, 2 cooks, and 2 maintenance people left. We were to live at the hospital with our sleeping quarters being on the 1st and 2nd floors while the patients were kept on the 3rd and 4th floors, but somehow though, there was a miscalculation with the rooms, and therefore I volunteered to sleep on the 5th floor where I would be alone, which didn't bother me at all. It was a Friday when I arrived, and since I didn't have to report to work until Monday, I had the weekend to myself. Now, Dover's had 7 floors total, with the 5th, 6th, and 7th floors remaining unused after several patients died under mysterious circumstances back in the 72nds. Of course, rumors were abound about the hospital being haunted, but at the time, I didn't believe in ghosts. After I met the other staff, I had dinner and decided to retire to my room. Now, the 5th floor had not been used for over 6 years, so you can imagine just how much dust had accumulated on everything. After cleaning my room, I took a shower and decided to turn in for the night. It was around 1 in the morning when something woke me from a deep sleep. Adjusting my eyes to the darkness, I saw a figure standing at the edge of my bed. It appeared to be a woman wearing one of those old-fashioned nurses' uniforms. I quickly turned the lights on and the figure was gone. After tossing and turning for about an hour, I finally fell asleep, and the next morning after breakfast, I decided to explore the rest of the 5th floor. Using a flashlight, I wandered the halls, peering into each room as I walked by until I reached the now abandoned nurses' station. It was as if time stood still. There was a long forgotten coffee mug with coffee stains still sitting on the counter, and all along the wall were old pictures of who I assumed were the nurses that used to work here. I studied the pictures well as I was curious about the previous staff that worked here. There was a picture that was taken during the Christmas of 1978, and I actually recognized Sue, not her real name, one of the nurses in the picture. I continued to explore the 5th floor until I began to feel sleepy. That night as I lay in bed, I could hear the faint sound of a woman crying. Thinking it was one of the patients, I went to check it out. As I exited my room and entered the dark hallway, I noticed that the crying was getting louder. I began walking towards the nurse's station and stopped, as the crying seemed to be coming from somewhere in the back of the station. I nervously called out, "Hello," but of course got no answer. That's when I spotted it, a door I didn't notice earlier. I slowly walked over to the door and opened it and noticed how dark it was inside this room. Using my flashlight, I scanned the room, and for a second there, I thought I saw a figure hunched over in the corner. The crying abruptly stopped. Anyway, using my flashlight, I began to explore the office, and that's when I spotted the picture of Dr. Ryan, not his real name. Dr. Ryan was one of the 3 doctors who remained behind at Dover. I had questions. It was the next day when I talked to Sue and asked her if any of the nurses died here, and she said, as a matter of fact, a nurse that used to work here went missing about 20 years ago. It was rumored that she was having an affair with one of the doctors and that she was also pregnant with his baby. Do you know who the doctor she was having an affair with? No, I don't. I had a feeling who it was, though. The remaining months were without incident until the last week before the hospital was to close. The morning started out normal. It was my day off and I decided to go down and get some breakfast. As I was about to enter the elevator to go down to the first floor, it began to malfunction. Then from behind me, I heard a blood curdling while almost like someone in pain, sending shivers down my spine. I stood there in utter shock, unable to move. Somehow though, I built up enough courage to turn around, and that's when I saw the ghost of the nurse gliding toward me. Unable to move, she approached me and within a blink of an eye placed her hand, which was somehow solid, on my shoulder. Horrible images flashed before my eyes as I saw her being murdered, then her killer hiding her body somewhere on the 5th floor. I saw who killed her. About an hour later, the hospital was bustling with police and forensic experts. I even saw them escorting Dr. Ryan out of the hospital in handcuffs. They found Donna's remains behind the walls inside Dr. Ryan's old office. See, 17 years ago, Dr. Ryan, who was married, was having an affair with a nurse from the hospital, who I'll call Donna. Several months into the affair, Donna found out she was pregnant and threatened to tell Mrs. Ryan if he didn't divorce her. Scared his wife would leave him, he killed Donna in a fit of rage. After Dr. Ryan's arrest, I showed Sue the picture of Donna, which I found at the nurse's station, and she confirmed what I already knew, that she was the nurse that went missing back in 1978. It was a few days after Dr. Ryan's arrest that the hospital closed its doors for the last time. As I exited the hospital door, I felt a great sense of sadness, so I glanced up at the 5th floor one last time, and standing there at the window was Donna. I waved at her and she smiled at me, then vanished. At that moment, I felt a sense of calm. I often think about that time back in '95 and wonder if Donna finally found peace in the afterlife. My pet crumbles in the rain. I stepped out of my tent with a sigh, my shoes squelching in the mud. Last night's unexpected storm definitely put a damper on my camping trip. Too bad I couldn't tell the weather to give me a break the 1 week I reserved to escape my stifling life. As I stood there with my hands on my hips, I heard a faint scrambling sound from the area behind me. Curious, I went to take a look, but even after staring for a few minutes, I had no idea what I was looking at. It appeared to be a creature about the size of a wolf. It must have taken shelter in that small cave during the storm, and now it was trying to avoid the giant puddles and the rocky terrain surrounding it. The creature didn't seem willing to get wet as it gave up and tried to climb the side of the mountain instead. But the smooth stone wasn't helpful, and it lost its grip, falling and landing with a splash. With a panicked flail, it jerked itself out of the puddle, and I gawked in stunned confusion at its hind leg. That limb had been the one to land in the puddle, and now it was crumpling. I crawled closer in mystified concern as the creature limped around in distressed circles. Its hind leg had completely disintegrated now, and the areas of its body that got the brunt of the splash were dimpled, just like sand under rain. The creature tried once again to climb up, and I couldn't help but whisper words of encouragement as I watched in tense anticipation. When it slipped again, I jumped up and ran over without thinking, causing the creature to shrink away and hide in the cave. I put my hands up and hunched down, trying to appear harmless as I surveyed the area for a way I could help. My gaze fell on a thick branch the storm had broken, and I made sure it was completely dry before I dragged it over and placed it across the puddles. Once I backed away, the creature peeked out of the cave, its head tilted as it looked at what I'd done. With tentative steps, it walked over to the branch and pawed at it, and I smiled as I watched it safely make its way over to dry land. My smile didn't last long, though. When the creature turned to me, it was rather large, and I was within attacking distance. Gulping, I put my hands up and hunched down again, and it gave me one last look before it scurried in the opposite direction. With a trembling sigh of relief, I shook away my fear and walked back to my tent, my thoughts running wild with questions. What was that creature? Was it really made of sand? Where did it come from? Why was it here? All questions with no answers. After washing up, I found a sunny spot and sat to have breakfast. But my spoonful of beans froze halfway to my mouth when I glimpsed the creature. It was peeking at me from behind a nearby tree, and I stared in awe as it stepped into the sun. It was made of sand, the golden brown grains glinting as they formed the creature's barreled body. Perked ears, long snout, and big eyes. It stood still, tense yet curious as its gaze traveled over my tent, my cooler, my water bottle, and my can of beans. I wasn't about to offer it water or beans, so I unwrapped a jerky stick and tossed it on the ground between us, my heart thudding in nervous anticipation. After a few hesitant seconds, the creature walked closer and pawed at the jerky, but it didn't sniff or taste it. Perhaps it couldn't smell or eat, or need to. It was obvious it could see, hear, and feel, though. And that fascinated me. How did this creature function? How did it even exist? Not sure what to do, yet relatively certain it wasn't going to attack me. I continued eating as I watched the creature inspect the offered jerky. Once it got bored, it limped closer, and I held my breath as it began nudging me with its paws and snout. Sand sprinkled into my beans as it placed its front paws on my shoulder and inspected my head. And I remained perfectly still save for my drumming heart. Its rough tongue slid across my cheek, and I flinched, grimacing as it felt like sandpaper. Sand trickled down my face, and I wondered if these creatures replenished or if they eventually shed themselves to nothing. As it continued to lick my face, I began noticing a lack of slobber and hot breath. That made sense. If it was made of sand, it wouldn't have internal fluids or need to breathe. Perhaps it didn't even have lungs, which explained why it was silent, never barking, growling, or whimpering. Did that mean it lacked all other organs? Was it solid sand? Curiosity getting the best of me, I placed a tentative hand on the creature's chest and gently pressed. There was no give. The creature stopped licking me, but it didn't draw back or attack, so I took the chance and slid my hand across its side. The texture reminded me of my childhood days at the beach where we'd make sand castles, compressing the sand tight so it wouldn't crumble. The creature's petrichor scent was soothing too. I smiled when I noticed its tail wagging, and I petted it again, letting out a surprised chuckle when it dropped its upper body onto my lap, its joyful tail smacking against my cooler. Its appearance and mannerisms were very similar to a dog's. But it wasn't a dog. Although I'd befriended it, I still had no answers, and I wanted them. I put my sandy can of beans down, and the creature hopped to the side when I made to stand up. After dusting myself off, I grabbed my hiking stick and beckoned the creature to follow me as I went off to explore the area. It didn't take us long to come across a shallow valley, its golden brown sand identical to the creature's. Fascinated, I walked closer, poking at the ground as I tried to find hidden burrows, and I stopped when I noticed a slow flow towards a dent in the center. It reminded me of sand in the upper part of an hourglass. Curious to know where the sand was falling, I lifted my hiking stick, ready to poke at the hole, but I paused when I glimpsed the creature from the corner of my eye. It hadn't followed me as it stood on a grassy patch, its teeth bared and body hunched in a silent growl as it scanned the valley. Its reaction was enough to get me scrambling out of there. The creature definitely was from this area, and it didn't like it. Perhaps it was dangerous here. Perhaps the creature had run away. It was best to leave. Despite finding myself with more questions than answers, I walked back to my campsite, the creature tagging along. Sinking into my folding chair, I grabbed a drink from my cooler and chugged it down, wondering if I should call anyone to investigate this mystifying phenomenon. Before I could make a decision, the creature drew me out of my thoughts as it dropped a pine cone at my feet, and I chuckled when it hopped back and ducked down, its tail wagging in anticipation. The game of fetch that followed was the most fun I'd had in a while, my rusty laughter cathartic. The creature seemed to be having the time of its life as well, running with endless stamina despite the missing leg. It reminded me of my childhood puppy, Growlithe, so I decided to name it Evie. It matched her. No, I wasn't going to call anyone. This was something special between Evie and me. I'd found her when she needed help, and she'd found me when I needed a break from my dry, lonely life. I had a few days left of my camping trip, and I wasn't going to ruin it for us. That evening after dinner, I entered my tent and slid into my sleeping bag, smiling as Evie crawled inside with me. She was heavy and shedding sand everywhere, but I didn't care as I hugged her, sighing in satisfied warmth. She snuggled in my arms and licked my face, and I chuckled as I winced, telling her to settle down. I had no idea if sand creatures slept, but if Evie was going to stick around, she had to allow me some nightly rest. Distant thunder rumbled and Evie lifted her head, her worried eyes focused on the entrance. I hugged her tighter and told her not to worry. The tent was waterproof and so was the sleeping bag. Lightning lit up the tent a few seconds later, and I calculated that the storm was only a few miles away. Thunder boomed again, but this time there was no lightning. Frowning, I sat up as thunder rumbled once more, and Evie jumped out of the sleeping bag as the ground shook beneath us. This time, lightning did flash, and I gasped at the huge, humanoid shadow cast upon the side of the tent. With my pulse racing, I grabbed my gun and flashlight, Evie snarling as the stranger took another thunderous step towards us. One swipe of its clawed hand left the zippered flap of my tent in tatters, and I screamed as my light illuminated a demonic face of sand, its sulfuric scent flowing in thick. My useless bullets went straight through the monster as it barged in, its size 4 times that of Evie's as it pinned me inside my sleeping bag. Crushing my cell phone, panicking, I thrashed and screamed as I blindly punched at its limbs. My eyes squeezed shut as noxious sand rained down on me. My manic struggling left my knuckles raw and abraded, but it did nothing to stop the monster from suffocating me beneath its weight. With sand falling in my nose and mouth, I coughed as I gasped for breath, but I refused to give up as I changed tactics and focused on spitting and clawing. This had to be the monster Evie was afraid of. Perhaps she even ran away from it, and now it was back, to kill me and to take her. Despite my terror, I was going to do all I could to keep it preoccupied until Evie found a safe place to hide. Thunder exploded above us, and lightning flashed as the tent erupted in the rush of pouring rain. This sound brought with it a drop of hope. With my desperate lungs spasming, I continued spitting, smearing my saliva over every part of the monster I could touch before clawing at it. If I could hurt it enough, perhaps I could wiggle free and lead it outside, letting the rain take care of the rest. Yet the monster didn't seem affected no matter how much I spit and scratched, and my tongue was now as dry as Evie's as my broken nails bled. My spastic heartbeat echoed in my head as stars danced beneath my eyelids, and my weak arms fell to my side as my strangled breaths croaked. Tears lined my eyes. I wasn't going to be able to do it. I was going to die alone, just like I lived. I just hoped Evie made it somewhere safe before it started to rain. My tears now coated my face, flowing down my cheeks, chin, and hair in a powerful surge as my consciousness teetered. One more breath filled my hungry lungs, jolting my body as I coughed and sputtered. The weight was off me, and I scrambled up in a mixture of confusion and dread. I was drenched, and it wasn't tears. Evie had torn the tent apart, a piece of it still in her mouth as she ran, the furious monster running after her. Panicking, I jumped to my feet and rushed after them, ignoring my bruised ribs as I called out for Evie. Thunder shook the trees around us as lightning flashed, and I caught a glimpse of the monster stumbling ahead of me, its body shrinking as it disintegrated beneath sheets of unforgiving rain. It fell to the ground, writhing, and I ran past it, my wild eyes searching for Evie, hoping she'd found a cave to hide in. Thunder overshadowed my hoarse voice, but I stopped calling out to her when lightning revealed a torn scrap of my tent, half buried in a pile of saturated sand. I fell to my knees, my hopeful heart crushed. She was gone. I remained there, my tears melding with the torrential rain until a powerful gust of wind sent the pile airborne. I got to my feet, bracing myself against the gale as I whispered my gratitude to the sand flying around me. We'd only known each other a few hours, yet she didn't hesitate to sacrifice herself to save my life. I hurried back to my campsite, pausing only to glare at the mound of sand that was once the monster. Resentment surged within me and I began kicking it, yelling expletives as I scattered the sulfuric sand and watched the manic winds carry it away. After my burst of furious grief, I packed up and rushed to my car. With my tent destroyed, the weather hostile, my safety uncertain, and my heart empty, I was ready to cut my trip short. After a night of restless dreams, I woke up with a listless sigh and trudged to the kitchen to make some breakfast. Opening the cupboard, I swallowed the lump in my throat when I pulled out my mug with the pine cone design. I wished I had something to remember Evie by. As I waited for the coffee maker, my melancholy gaze landed on my rolled-up sleeping bag, and I sat up. A mission now at hand. I emptied my cooler, dried it out, and shook my sleeping bag over it, filling a tenth of it with Evie's golden brown grains. With mournful contemplation, I placed the cooler on my kitchen table, petting the sand as I wondered what I could do with it to honor Evie. Perhaps I could mix it with clay and create a sculpture, or mix it with paint and design a mural, or sprinkle it in my garden and watch her grow through my flowers. All I knew was I didn't want to send it to any lab for experiments. Unable to make up my mind, I closed the cooler, and it remained there all day as I went about my chores, my thoughts and emotions racing each other. After another night of restless dreams, I shambled to the kitchen to make myself some coffee, and I froze when I noticed the cooler was no longer in the center of the table. It was near the edge. I whipped around, my heart thudding as I reached for a knife, Did someone break in? Did they know what happened to me out in the woods? Did they come in to steal what was left of Evie? With my wide eyes still scanning the area, I inched towards the cooler to check its contents, only for me to yelp and jump back when it shook. I stared in fearful bewilderment as it shook again, scratching sounds emanating from within as it jerked across the table, teetered over the edge, and fell to the floor with a crash, the cover flying off. My wide-eyed unease morphed to elated shock when a small creature trotted out of the cooler. It looked unmistakably like Evie, only much smaller and with 4 intact legs. Was this her? Were her memories intact too? With a rush of eager hope, I crouched down and held my trembling hand out, and the creature didn't hesitate to run over and lick my fingers with its sandpaper tongue. With tears of joy, I laughed as I carried Evie and hugged her tight, and she snuggled in my arms, sending sand flying with every wag of her tail. A feather in my ear. It was a Monday, a very quiet Monday. I pushed my hands against the bed and began to sit up and look out the window. The sun was rising, and so it was time to get up. So I got out of bed. Every morning, I try and guess the time. It was in English November, so I guessed the time is 7:34. I picked up my phone. 7:34. I was right. I stood in my bathroom and I was pretty happy with the spot-on guess. As I'm brushing my teeth, I think about the guess. Wow, I didn't even know my reasoning for it. I'm halfway through the 2 minutes when I felt something on my ear, like someone had ripped out a hair and was now twirling it in my ear. It was a sort of tickly feeling. I turned around expecting my younger brother, Daniel, to be there, but no one is to be seen. All right, Daniel, I know you're there. Nothing. You can come out now. I looked at the possibility that maybe he isn't there and I was just imagining it. 30 seconds later, I felt it again. Almost instantly, I turned around. I knew he was going to be right there holding a feather or something, but nothing. No one. This was weird. I felt it. It was real. Someone was doing it. It was not airbrushing against me. It's like holding the backside of your hand next to a wall but not touching it so the hairs feel the wall. It's a funny feeling, but it was real. Something touched my ear. I finished brushing my teeth and walked down 2 flights of stairs and down the long hallway into the living room. Mother was eating a boiled egg and Father was adjusting his tie, but Daniel was nowhere to be seen. Father, dearest, where is Daniel? Father is silent, but Mother responds. He left a note on the door saying he has gone to school early to study before his end of year. I process the information but then shoot a confused look at Mother. What's wrong, dear? She answers in a monotone yet very slightly concerned voice. Daniel took his end-of-year exams last Tuesday. Mother looked interested but then returned to a regular, calm face. Peculiar, but I wouldn't think much of it. I was still mildly concerned, but I'm sure I'd see him at school. I took my seat at the table and finished my egg rather quickly. It was already 8 o'clock and I had to be at St. William's for 8:30 sharp. I rushed out the door to find Father walking towards the family vehicle, briefcase in hand. Wait, St. William's is on your route if I am correct. Would you mind dropping me off? Father sighed and signaled for me to enter. We sat in silence until I arrived at 28 past with 2 minutes to spare. I arrive on time and have a normal day until 4th period. Mathematics. X equals 42, y equals minus 4z equals 8. 4x, 9xy7 is, plus 7z, 4 plus 12xy2, plus 44xe equals. I am not academically gifted, but I am not below average. I am concentrating hard when I feel it. It's not my ear this time. It's the back of my neck. I immediately turn around and try and slap my own neck to possibly catch the feather or toy of some kind. But nothing is there. No one was in the seat behind me. This is getting out of hand. Daniel must be playing a very elaborate prank on me and I am not for it. The rest of the day goes on normally. At lunch, I do not see him. Even after school, as we go home, we take the same bus, but I do not see him. Daniel is in the year below me, so there is a possibility he was at school here. I did not see him. I go home. I ask Mother if she's seen Daniel. No, I haven't, and neither have you, I assume. Not at all today. He wasn't even on the bus. Silence. I'd like to tell you, witnesses to this story, a little something about Mother and I. She shows very little facial emotion. The only time she will show emotion is when she's in a good mood or she is distraught, upset, and empty. But even with little emotion shown, I can tell her mood. We've got a bond. I could tell right at that second she was worried. Very worried. She walked towards the main phone, picked it up, and dialed 3 numbers. 999. She asks me to leave the room. I stand outside of the door as I hear my mother crying on the phone. My father comes in. We're crying, shouting. A door is slammed. Silence. About half an hour later, a knock comes on our door. Police. I stand in the corner of the room. I prepare for the bad news, but fortunately, they are not here with bad news. All they're here to tell Mother a search party has been formed and they are sending 2 officers to stay with her to help console her. Even though there is no proof in either direction, dead or alive, Mother is now in tears. Earlier I mentioned how she only shows emotion under circumstances. This is the first time in years I've seen her like this. After a while, she manages to calm down a bit. I sit at the table in silence, just hoping they find him. Hours pass and it is 11 p.m. The police have left and it's just me, Mother, and Father. The search party is still going and may go all night. I start heading to bed and say goodnight to Mother. I walk up to my bed and lie down. I turn the light off. About half an hour into trying to fall asleep, I feel it. But it's not my neck or my ear. It's everywhere. I jump out of bed and rip off my duvet cover. Nothing. I rip off my sheet. Nothing. I take out my mattress and nothing. I take off my clothes. I take off everything and there are no bugs, no feathers. Nothing. Paranoid. I place my mattress on the floor, grab a new sheet, a new duvet cover, and sleep like that. I manage to fall asleep, but around 1 a.m. I wake up. As soon as I wake up, I scream and stand up shaking. Terrified. It felt different this time, like 1,000 spiders all over. I turn on the lights and I cannot see anything on my body, but they're there. I know it. They're crawling on me, everywhere. I throw up in the corner of my room. I sink to the floor crying in acceptance as all the spiders crawl over me. I fall asleep. I wake up. I can still remember everything, but I'm clothed. The mattress is on my bed frame. There is no vomit. I'm confused. But a thought pops into my head. Maybe it was just a nightmare. I face reality. It was just a nightmare. And maybe Daniel's disappearance was a nightmare. I wake up and put some clothes on. I go for a lucky guess at the time, 7:34. Of course, it is. That was what it was in the nightmare. I know Daniel's alive, I know it. I just want to see him again. I walk into the living room happier than ever. I ignore everything in my way, anything I might have missed. And there he is, Daniel, sitting on the sofa. I want to give him the biggest hug in the world, but I feel the need to perform a little prank. I pick up a feather pen and put it in his ears. He quickly turns around and as he sees me, I jump into a hug. But I don't hug him. I go right through him. I look at him. He can't see me. I try to slap him. He can't feel it. I go to Mother. Nothing. I go to Father. Nothing. Thank you guys for watching. If you enjoyed these stories, then hit the like. See you guys next time.